Up until now, we've been invoking the assumption of perfect competition. This means that firms have to take the price that's given to them by the marketplace. It also means that no matter what production decisions the firm makes, the amount that they produce can't affect price. Here we're going to relax that assumption and look at what happens when firms have what we call market power. This is an instance of where we have imperfect competition. The material covered in this set of videos comes from chapters 11, 12, and 13. Now, in order to understand the impact of market power, we have to understand something about the market structure. And to do that, we think about the different characteristics of markets. One way we characterize markets is in terms of the number of firms and their size distribution. And why this is important is that the conditions of perfect competition tend to break down when the number of firms falls. So to say this another way, the fewer the number of firms and or the greater the percentage of product sales accounted for by a few firms in the market, the greater the concentration in that market. And when there's a greater concentration in that market, it's more likely that prices are going to be determined by forces other than supply and demand. So if you have few firms or a number of dominant firms, that is a number of very large firms in the marketplace, you tend to have a concentrated market, and the prices that we observe tend not to be determined by the interaction of supply and demand alone. Now, another characteristic that we pay attention to when we're thinking about imperfect competition is product differentiation. We've talked a bit about this during the semester, but just as a reminder, product differentiation has to do with the extent to which buyers perceive a difference in products. That is, it has to do with whether or not consumers consider, let's say, a 1 liter container of 2% milk as being the same regardless of which firm sells it to them. There are quality characteristics that might be different across those two different containers of milk that make them different in the eyes of the consumer, or there might be reputation effects associated with the two different firms that make those products different in the eyes of the consumer, in which case you'd have product differentiation. Now, so again, this goes back to whether or not we have a homogeneous product. Now remember that with homogeneous products, buyers consider products offered by alternative suppliers to be similar, and in fact perfect substitutes. The more differentiated a product becomes in the minds of the buyer, the more opportunity the supplier has to raise the price of the product above the competitive price and take advantage of the buyer's perceptions concerning the product's unique characteristics. So the more differentiated products are from one another, the more likely you are to see a price that isn't the competitive price, that's in fact higher than a perfectly competitive price, and that's simply a reflection of the fact that that product maybe has unique characteristics to it that no other product has, and so the firm that's selling it can sell it at a higher price. Another issue that we think about when we talk about market structure characteristics are barriers to entry. We've talked a lot about barriers to entries at different points of this semester. Now remember that if barriers to entry are low, even firms in highly concentrated industries have a little opportunity to set prices above competitive levels. The reason for that is that if the firm raised its price above competitive levels to try to increase its profit, that would encourage entrants to come into the marketplace. Because entry barriers are low, that entry is easy to facilitate and you get more firms in the marketplace. The more firms there are in the marketplace, the less likely you are to see prices above a competitive price. Now there are 4 common barriers to entry. These 4 entry barriers are the absolute unit cost advantage, economies of size or economies of scale, capital access and costs, and preferential government policies. Now the first 3 barriers to entry are really about the cost that firms will have when they try to enter a market. In the first instance, with absolute unit cost advantage, the idea here is that there's no level of output for which the new firm could operate competitively. Existing firms in the marketplace just have such lower costs that there's no way a new firm would be able to outprice them or outcompete them in any way, shape, or form. Economies of scale is kind of like that. The idea here is that smaller firms will face higher costs of production, and so those newer firms, if they were to enter the market, would have to be much larger in order to enter. So that larger size of firm will often result in price reductions, but even in the face of that, the firm will face difficulties in the sense that they've got to enter at a very large scale of operation which they may not be able to afford. Capital access is often related to number 2, but firms with those large initial investments may only capture a bit of the marketplace. Preferential government policies are also quite evident through things like patents, copyrights, and import controls. And we've talked also about issues like quota and the impact of having production quota as part of a marketing scheme. That could be an example of a barrier to entry if the cost of that quota is prohibitively high and new entrants aren't able to enter the marketplace.
The fourth structural characteristic that we're interested in when it comes to markets is the economic environment. And there's really three aspects of supply and demand that are important here. One is the level of output in the industry. So here the idea is that the larger the market, the larger the sales volume, and the more profit opportunities will be available to firms at all levels, be they large firms or small firms. So large markets, you tend to see a lot of competitiveness simply because the fact the market is so large that it can accommodate many different firms and many different firms of different sizes. The second dimension that's important here is the responsiveness of supply and demand to price changes, and also the responsiveness of demand to income changes. So really what we're talking about are supply and demand elasticities. Now what's important here is the elasticity of demand. And in fact, the more elastic demand is, the greater the opportunities for new entrants. And the reason for this is that new entrants will be able to price at a somewhat lower price than perhaps existing firms, and demand will increase quite a bit, but price won't change by that much. And so when you have an elastic demand curve, you tend to see more competitive price behavior from firms in the marketplace. The last one, in terms of the economic environment, is the proportion of food expenditures accounted for by the industry. If demand is stable, growth will stagnate if only a small portion of income is spent on food products. We see this in Canada, and this goes back to the notion of Engel's law that we talked about when we were looking at demand equations. So what's important also when we're dealing with imperfect competition is that we actually have many different types of market structures, and they differ based on whether we're dealing with selling a product or buying a product. If we're selling a product, if we're a firm, we can face price competition. In that case, we're facing the competitive equilibrium. But there's other models of market structures for selling. One that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about is monopoly. That's shown on the bottom of the left-hand side. We also see other forms of imperfect competition through things that are called oligopoly power or oligopoly and monopolistic competition. Now we also see market power and market structures in imperfect competition on the buying side. We can have buyers facing pure competition or perfect competition, but they can also face differing forms of imperfect competition through things that are known as monopsony power or oligopsony power or monopsonistic competition. The main point I want you to take away from this is that what side of the transaction you're on could influence the type of analysis and the way you have to think about the problem with respect to issues like imperfect competition. We're going to spend most of our time focusing on imperfect competition and selling, but the translation into imperfect competition and buying is somewhat transparent. Now when it comes to imperfect competition and selling, there's some market structure characteristics that differ across the different types of competition and selling. And so this table tries to illustrate these in a bit of a synthesized and simplistic way. So as you see down the left-hand column, we have the market structure characteristics including number of sellers, whether or not the product can be differentiated, the ease of entry or exit, the ability of the firm to set price, and also whether or not it's possible to have long-run excess profits, that is, economic profits that aren't zero in the long run. In the second column, we show these characteristics for perfect competition. And what we see is that under perfect competition, we have many sellers, products aren't differentiated, there's unrestricted ease of entry and exit, there's no ability to set price, and through those competitive forces, we know that there's going to be no excess profits in the long run. Monopolistic competition is a subtle differentiation from perfect competition where you have many sellers, not a lot but many, so it's less than you would have under perfect competition, but products are differentiated. And that's an important distinction between perfect competition and monopolistic competition, is that assumption of differentiated products. Under monopolistic competition, ease of entry or entry and exit is also unrestricted, and there's some ability to set price. But because there's ease of entry and exit, it's not possible for excess profits to exist in the long run. Under oligopoly, which is again a further deviation from perfect competition, we tend to see a few number of sellers. Products could or could not be differentiated with oligopoly, and there's usually some partial restrictions with respect to entry and exit. There's also some ability to set price, and because there's ability to restrict entry to some degree, long-run profits can be greater than zero. And with perfect or pure monopoly, we have one seller. This is the only person who's selling this product, and so they're the monopolist. They have a unique product. There's absolute restrictions on entry and exit. Monopolists can erect barriers to entry that prevent any kind of entry. And because of that, monopolists can set price. This also means that they have excess profit in the long run. Now, down at the bottom of this slide, it actually shows a little window that says face downward sloping demand curves. And this is one of the issues that's very important when we're dealing with perfect competition versus monopoly. A firm that's in a perfectly competitive environment will face the prices given. Effectively, that individual firm, that single firm, observes prices and they treat that as though it were a perfectly elastic demand curve. If you have any firm that's monopolistic, it's behaving like a monopolistic competitive firm or an oligopoly or a monopoly, they behave as though they face a downward sloping demand curve. So they recognize that if they increase price, they're going to reduce demand a little bit. By the same token, if they decrease price, they recognize that they could increase their demand by a little bit. Now, I want to focus on monopoly. And the reason why I want to focus on monopoly is that perfect competition and pure monopoly are the bookends of the competitive spectrum that we observe in all sorts of markets. And in fact, perfect competition, while it's the gold standard in terms of the efficiency of allocating resources in a market, pure monopoly is the exact opposite of that. It's the polar opposite. It's the most distortive in terms of the price signals that are sent to consumers in the marketplace. And so it actually is on the other end of the stick if you want to think about competition running from pure competition to absolutely no competition. So with monopoly, the idea here is that there's only one seller of the good, and there's no close substitute. So consumers really don't have a choice. They can only buy from the person who's selling that good. Now, because there's only one seller of the good, that means that the monopoly's output is the market output. So whatever the monopolist decides to sell is the available quantity that's on the marketplace. The other issue is that the monopolist faces the market demand curve. Since that market demand curve is downward sloping, the monopolist doesn't lose all of its sales if it raises price, unlike a competitive firm, where if a competitive firm raises its price a little bit from the competitive price, they're going to price themselves out of the market. Now, what's also important here with monopoly is that output is determined at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So this harkens back to some of the issues that we talked about at the beginning of this semester when we were looking at supply of firms and profit maximization decisions, where we looked at the slope of the revenue curve and compared it to the slope of the cost curve in determining what would be the profit maximizing level of output. And in that instance, recall that the slope of marginal revenue would equal the slope of the cost curve, or stated another way, that marginal revenue would equal marginal cost. So the same kind of rule applies with monopolists. Now, to illustrate this in what I hope is a little more intuitive way, I've actually drawn the monopolist profit maximization problem as well as the competitive firm's profit maximization problem in this diagram. So let's assume that the competitive firm faces a price of P1 and they're currently producing Q units of output. In that case, their benefits, their sales, their revenue is going to be A. Now, if they increase their output by 1 unit, the price isn't going to change for them. It's still going to be P1. And the reason for that is that this competitive firm is so small relative to the rest of the marketplace that they're taking that price as fixed, and any change in the firm's output isn't going to change the price that they face. When they increase their output by 1 unit, they're then going to earn B units of revenue. For the monopolist, it's subtly different. So let's take a look at the example on the right-hand side of this screen. Here, the monopolist is pricing at a price of P1 and selling Q units of output. And their benefits in this case are areas A and C. Their revenue is areas A and C. Now let's just suppose, for the sake of argument, that the monopolist wants to increase their output by 1 unit, going from Q to Q1. Now the monopolist faces a demand curve, so they realize that if they increase their output, they're going to have to lower price. When they do that, they're going to have to lower price to an amount P2 in order for the market to clear, in order for demand to equal the amount that the firm has put on the marketplace. Let's call that incremental revenue that they receive in increasing output from Q to Q1, but at a price of P2 equal to area B. Now, what's going to happen here is we're going to try to derive marginal revenue for that firm. So in this slide, I've got a table that shows the initial revenue under a competitive model and under a monopoly model. And recall, under the competitive model with the initial price of P1, the firm earned revenue of area A, and for the monopoly, they earned revenue of area A plus C. The revenue from selling 1 more unit for the competitive firm was area A plus B. For the monopoly, it was also area A plus B. But remember, it's in a different diagram, and it's in a diagram where the firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. If we take the difference between A plus B for a competitive firm and subtract its initial revenue, what we find is that their marginal revenue is going to be equal to area B. But because I've been dealing with a 1 unit increase in output, that's just the price that they face, P1. So area B is really equal to the price P1. For the monopoly, it's a little bit different. What we have to do is take their revenue when they face the price of P2, that is area A plus B, and subtract from it the initial revenue that they had with a price of P1, that is area A plus C. And when we go through that math, we see over here that if we take A plus B and subtract A plus C, what we end up with is a difference in the revenue equal to area B minus C. Well, area B is just going to equal the price P2. I know it's going to be the price P2 because they've increased their output by only 1 unit. So their marginal revenue from selling that 1 additional unit is just going to be the price P2. But we're subtracting area C from it. What this means is that the monopolist is actually constrained by the market demand curve. The fact that they face that demand curve constrains some of the choices that the monopolist can make. And in fact, since demand slopes downward, the monopoly faces a trade-off between a higher price and a lower quantity or a lower price and a higher quantity. They've got to recognize that as they change their level of output, they're also going to face a different price, and there's a trade-off that they have to choose over. So this complicates how they actually go about choosing the level of output. Now, to see how they choose a level of output, to illustrate how a monopoly chooses the quantity of output that's going to help maximize profit, let's assume that the monopolist faces this demand curve shown on the slide. This demand curve is shown in the notes as quantity demanded is equal to 30 minus 2 times the price. Table 8.2 in the notes summarizes this demand curve, and it shows the corresponding quantity demanded at each price. With those prices and quantities, I can actually calculate total revenue as simply price times quantity. And I can actually plot that total revenue on the bottom diagram shown here. So I have quantity on the x-axis in this bottom panel and then total revenue on the y-axis. Now, just like we could calculate marginal cost and marginal revenue for the competitive firm, we can also calculate marginal revenue for a monopolist. This is simply going to be the change in revenue divided by the change in output. Okay, and so I can draw that by considering the different changes in revenue associated with some unit change in quantity produced. And if I do that for this particular example, the marginal revenue curve is going to look like this. Now, one thing that's important to note is that the marginal revenue curve intersects the quantity axis at 15 units. Now, at that point where it intersects the quantity axis, marginal revenue is equal to 0, and that corresponds with the peak of the total revenue curve. We also know that when quantity demanded is equal to 30 units, price will be 0, and that'll give us total revenue is equal to 0. Now, what we want to do is think about how do we figure out what's the profit maximizing level of output for the firm. Remember that for the monopolist, their decision on how much to produce is driven by equating marginal revenue to marginal cost. Now, we haven't got cost on this diagram yet, but we can assume that the total cost curve looks something like this, just a straight line. And when we do that, we can actually calculate marginal cost as we have in traditional examples in the past, where this red line indicates marginal cost. It's also going to equal average total cost in this particular example. The monopolist is going to choose a level of output where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. I'm circling that point on this diagram right here. Right? So they're going to choose a level of output such that their marginal cost of production is equal to marginal revenue. And that's indicated as QM on the lower axis of the bottom panel of the diagram. That's the quantity that the monopolist would produce. Now, when the monopolist produces QM units of output, they're then also going to try to choose a price such that they'll sell all of those units of output. And so they're going to map that quantity that they're going to produce up to the demand curve and then calculate what that monopoly price is going to be. In this case, it's PM. So what's important here is to note that there's a gap between the price that the monopolist charges and average total cost. And that measures the profit or the loss, if there is a loss, that the monopolist is going to make. Now, one thing that's also important that you'll notice in this diagram is that the monopolist is in the elastic portion of the demand equation. And in fact, it's generally true that the monopolist will not produce in the inelastic region of demand. They won't produce in this lower region of the demand curve. They'll always produce in this upper region of the demand curve. So what we've just seen is that the monopolist is going to choose a level of output that equates marginal revenue and marginal cost, and that's going to lead to an outcome where the quantity produced is actually less than the competitive outcome, and the price will be above the competitive outcome. I know that the price would be above the competitive outcome because the monopolist isn't taking price equals marginal cost as their decision rule in setting a profit maximizing level of output. They're trying to equate marginal revenue and marginal cost. Now, there are some important welfare effects associated with monopoly that I want to talk about. In the diagram on the right-hand side of the screen, I've got an illustration of a competitive outcome. We see that when we've got that upward sloping marginal cost curve and the downward sloping demand curve, we'll end up with an equilibrium denoted with EC, where we've got an equilibrium price of PC and an equilibrium quantity of QC. If I add the marginal revenue curve and I calculate the level of monopoly output, it's going to be QM, where again I want you to note that the quantity produced by the monopolist is less than the price taking firm. The price that the monopolist would charge would be PM, which is above PC. Now there's also going to be a case where the marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. Now I'm going to put some labels in these different areas to help us understand the welfare effects associated with these outcomes. So if you focus on the competitive outcome, what you should see is that consumer surplus would be equal to area A plus B plus C. Likewise, if we're dealing with a competitive outcome, producer surplus would be areas D plus E. Now, with the monopoly outcome, because price is higher, consumers lose area B plus C. So their consumer surplus is now only area A. They've lost areas B plus C. So there's a loss for consumers. So they don't like monopoly. For the monopolist, their surplus also changes. Only now there's a transfer of area B from consumers to producers, to the monopolist, and the monopolist loses area A from their producer surplus. So now their surplus is equal to area B and D. So for the monopolist, they actually like this situation because the gain in area B here is less than the loss of area E, and so they're actually earning more money than they were before. Now, that's not the only effect that's important here. So while there is a transfer of rents, of monopoly rent, of income from consumers to producers through area B, there's also a loss of consumer surplus. In particular, consumer surplus of area C is lost and producer surplus of area E is lost. We've talked about this before. Area C plus E are deadweight losses. In fact, that's the deadweight loss associated with monopoly. And so what we can say is that welfare will be lower with monopoly, and it's going to be lower for a monopoly since price is above marginal cost, and so consumers buy at a level less than the competitive outcome. And this comes at a cost to the general economy because the prices that are being transmitted through the marketplace result in an inefficient allocation of resources, and that results in a deadweight loss for the marketplace. So the monopoly idea is relatively straightforward, that firms can actually affect the price that they charge by changing their level of output, and they're going to choose a level of output and a price that's going to end up with a profit maximization. And in the process of doing that, they're distorting prices in a way that actually lowers consumer surplus, it increases producer surplus, and it causes a deadweight loss. But you might wonder, why do monopolies arise? And that's actually a very good question. There are cost issues associated with why we actually may see a monopoly arise. In particular, there could be cost advantages. A monopolist may control a key input that other firms don't have access to, and that gives that monopolist a cost advantage over some other firm. A monopolist may also have superior technology or better ways of organizing production that gives it a cost advantage. Another way that we sometimes see monopolies arise is through something that's called a natural monopoly. And the idea here is there's one firm that can produce the total output for the market at a lower cost than several firms could. And really what we're talking about are economies of size. And we actually see this in sectors that are often regulated or operated by the public sector, such as transportation and utilities. There's also monopolies because of government action. Governments sometimes affect barriers to entry and make it difficult for firms to obtain a license to operate. So for instance, you can't operate private hospitals very easily in this country, or at least access to public healthcare funds if you have a private hospital. We also see restrictions related to things like taxi cab licenses. as well, there's professional organizations such as that represent lawyers and physicians that actually make it difficult to obtain a license to practice. And that acts as a barrier of entry. And those barriers of entry associated with the legal profession and physicians are backed by government. Governments can sometimes also enact barriers to entry by granting a firm the right to be a monopoly. We often see this with public utilities. And we sometimes see auctioning of the rights to be a monopoly in the form of auctioning of local cable TV or bandwidth to particular individuals. Now, we have another form in which we see monopolies arise, and that's through patents. Now, patents are really interesting because what patents do is they provide an exclusive right to the inventor to sell a new or useful product, process, or substance for a fixed period of time. So they're the only person who can, the person who's been granted these rights are the only person who can manufacture and sell that product, process, substance, or design. And so what we're doing when we grant a patent is we say we're going to give you the ability to act like a monopolist, but in exchange for that you have to reveal all the information in the idea that you had that you wanted to patent. And so patents become public. And so there's a trade-off here, that the person who's developed that innovation wants to have the ability to price like a monopolist, but the charge that the government the cost that the government charges them is that the inventor has to reveal that information associated with their idea so that other people can use it for different reasons. So a patent is really granting an inventor the right to be a monopolist, and that does it for a fixed number of years. Now, part of the reason why it's structured in that way is that they want to use patents to try to stimulate research. And so it's a trade-off. Government says to the innovator, we'll let you be a monopolist, but you have to tell us and the public what the idea is, and that might stimulate innovation by others. This is a good place to stop. We'll pick up with this in class on Monday and work through an example of monopoly. And I'm actually going to show you some examples, some real-life examples of firms that have been caught acting like a monopolist, and talk about some of the consequences associated with that.